to be exploring the culture of consciousness, as we do this week and every week on Thursday here on the Progressive Radio Network. And today we're going to be talking to a seasoned ceremonial magician named Sam Webster, and I'll introduce him a little bit more. But I've been very interested in magic and the occult for much of my life, but I approach it not so much as a religion or a belief system, but as a way of understanding different aspects of consciousness and culture, how expectations, rituals, anthropology, images, stories, fictions, how all of these can be brought into a certain kind of intensity, a transformative intensity of the imagination and of the body. And I really think that it's a shame that there's a tremendous amount of interesting stuff that has happened and is happening within the occult stream in the 20th century. But for a variety of reasons, it's kind of cut off from a lot of other dialogues, a lot of other cultural movements, a lot of other discourses. The connections are there, but they're often hidden. And the fault is kind of on both sides. A lot of people who work inside magic sort of enjoy the esotericism of it, the secrecy of it, the hidden powers trip, which tends to keep it even more in the underground. And on the other side, people who would, to my mind, be very interested in these matters, people dealing with certain kinds of art movements or performance or film, psychology, anthropology, subcultures, contemporary music. There's field after field of our modern world has been influenced in various ways by these occult occurrents. And yet they're often sort of not really dealt with very well or dealt with very superficially because of a lot of not very well-informed ideas about the richness of the tradition and the richness of the ongoing recreation of what the occult means, what magic means, what these mysteries, what form these mysteries can take in a modern world as we create new frameworks for understanding the mind, for understanding how we engage with the imagination, how we engage with ritual activity with groups of people. So I think it's a very fascinating and important discourse, even for people who have no interest in, mumbo jumbo and waving wands in front of pentacles or anything like that. So we're going to explore the stuff. Before I bring on Sam, I want to introduce Expanding Minds esoteric librarian, Maja Daou. Maja, how you doing?
I'm good, Eric. How are you?
Pretty good. Hey, so what do you think about magic? How important is magic in your life?
Well, I am a true lover of mumbo jumbo and magic wands and wizards and all that. And for me, ever since I was a little kid, I felt magic in my heart. Like I just was constantly aware of it. So I, like you, have been very interested in magic and the occult ever since I was little. And it's funny, you mentioned, I just wanted to say, you mentioned magic's influence and occult's influence on different things. And one of my favorite books is Turn Off Your Mind by Gary Lockman, and I thought he did a really good job of kind of delineating how the occult infiltrates many different areas, even though he focused mainly on rock and roll. And for me, it touched very close to my heart because a lot of magic I see comes through music. And, for me, music is a good ritual way of manifesting things. And, we get a lot of wizards in the music world, and they can really ritually bring things in through intention. And I'm so glad that we're talking to Sam today because one of my favorite things about magic is how people throughout the ages kind of tend to form these secret societies and fraternities and brotherhoods and sisterhoods and covens. They always have to come together in these little secret groups where they, put on their robes and wave their wands, and then that's where magic is practiced. It's not never kind of out in the open, or it's always in these secret little fraternities. So Sam, I'm sure, will be able to talk about that a little more today. So I love that kind of secret, special aspect of magic.
Yeah, and to introduce Sam just a bit more is that among many experiences and studies, He is the chief adept of the open source Order of the Golden Dawn. And the open source will be one of the interesting things we'll be talking about in terms of the way that his approach to ceremonial magic steps aside from some of the traditions of the very traditions of secrecy and hiddenness that Maja talked about. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about Sam. He got a Master of Divinity at actually, I'm not sure where'd you get your Master of Divinity from, Sam?
Thomas Starr King School for the Ministry at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley.
Excellent. There you go. And he's been initiated in a number of orders: Wiccan, Buddhist, Hindu, Masonic traditions. Was an adept of the official Golden Dawn, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And is a writer as well as a community priest in the pagan community, principally a priest of Hermes. So, Sam, thanks so much for being on the show.
It's great to be here, Eric.
Great. Well, I just wanted to start out just because, some of our listeners may, people, again, who don't know very much about ceremonial magic probably have a lot of images, Hollywood images in their head about it. I'd like to maybe start off with just a little bit brief kind of account of what the Golden Dawn is, since that's one of the principal traditions you work in, is this Golden Dawn tradition.
Sure. The Golden Dawn is an offshoot of Masonry. From the Masons' point of view, it's called fringe Masonry. And what it comes from is a bunch of people who wanted to use the Masonic techniques, but go deeper into the esoteric side of things, to actually practice the art of invocation and conjuration, to explore magic. And the Golden Dawn was founded in 1888 to do just that, and including women as well, on an equal basis. So it's always been a very strong feminist tradition as well. And down the years, it's grown and expanded and had quite an influence.
Yeah, there seems to be one of those orders that has had an influence in some ways quite beyond the size of the order at the time, in some ways rivaling Theosophy in terms of the influence that it went on to have on later occult currents. But so you're in a different thing, the open source Order of the Golden Dawn. What's the relationship between those?
Well, one of the reasons why the Golden Dawn has the influence it does is because it got open-sourced many, many years ago, actually back in the 1930s when Israel Regardie published his notes on what the Golden Dawn was about and how it worked and its rituals and techniques and doctrines and so forth. And since then, it has fed into the broader pagan movement, providing fundamental technology to enable pagans to build their religion. Well, in 2001, after a workshop that I was just doing on ceremonial magic in general, I got asked to refound a branch of the order. But we decided not to do this on the basis of secrecy, considering that actually that's been more of a problem than a help, and to publish our material, to make it available to anyone who wanted to see what we were doing and how we were doing it, and if they wanted to play with us or not.
That seems to be like it's a pretty kind of radical move, actually, in terms of the history of these sorts of orders in the West, where secrecy was so important. Can you talk a little bit about why secrecy was important, and then why, for you, in any case, it's no longer appropriate for our world today, and what's really changed there?
Well, Eric, the secrecy was primarily to avoid persecution. The practice of magic is the practice of the ancient or classical religion, often called pagan religion's technical arts of spirituality. And as being pagan, or at least pre-Christian, these technologies are forbidden within the Christian framework, and Europe has been a Christian continent for, well, over 1,000 years now. So anyone who practiced these things was considered either a heretic or a witch in the worst sense of the word in the sense of, oh, we now figured out you're a witch and we need to kill you, or other kinds of magic users equally considered necessary to exterminate. So we tended to hide, but that era is over. Both people don't really worry about magic users poisoning their cows or preventing their crops from growing so much anymore. Also, the material's all out in public, so there's no point in hiding the actual technology. Frankly, the fact that it's so widely published is our best means of preserving it. But since this has also been an impediment, the hiddenness of the magical movement has brought about more fear than anything else. We saw no point in maintaining that kind of stance.
Well, there's two things that come to mind from that. One is that in addition to the reasons of needing a protection, that at least by the 19th century, there's another kind of thing that enters in, which is that, of course, it feels special to be in a secret order. It feels it gives you an added kind of sense of engagement, of status, and that once you enter into a kind of order that's secret, if you don't know the layers that are above you and what's going on, what's going to happen next, that it creates a certain kind of what you might call anthropological situation, a certain situation of how power works and who's in and who's out. And it seems to me one of the things that's happening now with the occult, partly with the explosion of information, which I'll ask you about in a second, is that we're exploring a really different model where these many of these things are out in the open, and that there's actually a kind of populist or democratic or less hierarchical approach to the mystery. So it seems to kind of suggest a real, almost like a political change inside the practice of these, ancient traditions.
You got a point. I think there's something political about it. Certainly, anytime we change the nature of human relationships, we're changing the political ground. Now, mind you, the fraternal movement, which has this kind of quality of secrecy, where members are told some things that non-members are, that was a very important aspect of society from about the 1700s up until about the mid-1900s. But television and the movies basically kills this. The Masons are just the most old and honored of all those fraternities, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens of them, and pretty much every adult was a member of these things at one time. So the Golden Dawn is essentially just one of those, but a little bit more technical, shall we mind. However, there's a fundamental flaw in this, and this is the challenge that happened back in the early part of the modern period amongst people who were technologically inclined. In the guild movement from the medieval period up into the early modern period, most people held their technical knowledge closely. It wasn't shared, it wasn't compared, it wasn't tested broadly. So this person knew this special secret, or this group of people knew this other piece of technology. And because they weren't comparing notes, all of this advanced very, very slowly. But when the forebears of the modern magical movement spoke up, the Rosicrucians, their specific request of the learned of Europe was to share their knowledge for the common good. And when they did, this caused the scientific and technological revolutions that produced society that we have today. From this,
the next question I was going to ask you was all about technology, because you use the terms open source, which comes up inside of software application development and has expanded into a kind of philosophy of computing and getting projects done. You talk about a lot of the ritual techniques as a kind of technology, and then you point out that some of the fundamental dynamics of secrecy within fraternal orders and within magical orders have been changed by the changing media landscape, the introduction of film and television and more kinds of things. So it seems like there's something fundamental about technology in the evolution of this current that you're talking about, particularly as you try to grapple with its consequences today. Can you talk a little bit about the use of the metaphor or the phrase open source in terms of technology and magic?
Sure, Eric. Fundamentally, we have to remember that it is technology. The ancient Greek word for this was hieratica techne, holy technology. Literally, that was the term they used for all these kinds of practices. It's just tech, and at the level of technology, we can then see how, what Europe does is essentially the same as what India does, China, Japan, even to the Americas at a certain fundamental level, though the cultural connection's not quite the same. When we hold the knowledge of this material too close, we then don't get to compare what we're doing with what someone else does, and there's both distance created by that and a lack of ability to learn from somebody else's mistakes. This stuff is powerful. If you use it wrong, it can hurt you, usually in subtle ways that most people won't notice, but they certainly don't help. But if you use it correctly, then the benefits are immense. A kind of clarity of function and purpose in life, a harmony with the world that arises from it. That's basically what the goal is. And when we get to learn from other technologies, from other religions, and their tech, their means, then we can improve our own. And in our open source framework, by publishing our material, by engaging with other technologies as they have been published, i.e. open sourced, we can then learn to edit and transform the not-so-well working aspects of our own practice into something that's much more effective. The most immediate example is the inclusion of the lessons of the Buddha Dharma, of Buddhism, within our practice, which brings about a lot more kindliness and gentleness amongst ourselves and a really deeper, richer kind of practice.
Well, since you brought that up, let's talk about that a little bit, not only in terms of what Buddhism can do in different contexts, in this case in the context of a ceremonial magic tradition, but also how you feel about the operation of consciously, intentionally mixing and matching elements that come from different traditions. You know, seems to be it's a fundamental aspect, of religion to some degree. There's always a little bit of innovation and mixing and matching going on, although they often don't really acknowledge it. But as the 20th century's rolled on, there's been more and more forms of very creative, sometimes sort of underhanded, sometimes not very well done, forms of fusing and mixing and matching. Some of it happens very organically, and in the case of the order that you're working with, where this very other tradition, in many ways, of the Buddha Dharma enters into the context of a ceremonial framework. So what is that like? How do you approach that task or that challenge of elegantly weaving together things that are in many ways from very different contexts?
Well, this is where the open source paradigm provides the right metaphor. All we're talking about is code that runs on a system. If you think about a ritual, it's a procedure. It's a set of activities that you do. This is no different from computer code, where it's a set of activities that the CPU performs to get the work done. What we've discovered is that processes will transform your nature to a certain extent, your consciousness. When we scrape away the surface layer of culture, surface layer of tribe and history, we get down to some bedrock of technology, of means to change things. And at that level, there is no Buddha Dharma, there is no Western magic, it's just means. And at that level, we can blend techniques that serve the functions that one given technology, in this case Western magic, didn't have. Some pieces that had either gotten lost or never developed. The advantage we have in talking to our brethren in the East is that they'll work a given technology for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and keep notes on the process and discover problems with it and benefits in it, and we can learn from basically our seniors here and improve our own means thereby.
Great. I just want to mention I'm talking to Sam Webster, the chief adept of the open source Order of the Golden Dawn. If you have any questions, you can send us an email at mind@techgnosis, TECHGNOSIS.com, or you can call into the Progressive Radio Network at 1-888-873-4643. Since we're talking about different traditions and currents of magical technology, of mystical tools and techniques and ideas, what is specific uniquely valuable? What is the unique character of the Western stream of esoteric, Gnostic, Hermetic magic in contrast or alongside other mystical traditions, either within monotheism or from the cornucopia of paths in the East?
What's unique about it, you're asking?
Yeah.
What's special about it? All right. Well, one of the most fundamental elements of this is that it is the sacred technology of the West and has been since Pythagoras, maybe earlier, Heraclitus and on. These methods have been woven throughout our philosophy and literature and all of our arts. And so, in a certain sense, they're written in our native language. They're written in our native way of thinking. And as such, they're very accessible. They're relatively easy to engage. Eastern material has the difficulty of language to translate the distance, and also the bane of Orientalism, thinking of the East as somehow different or alien from us. And so it takes a bit more effort to pull in material from that end of the planet. But from my perspective, there really isn't that much of an alienness to it. This bit of thinking of East and West really doesn't make sense when you're looking at the planet from the moon. It's just human. And as such, it's part of, all of it is part of our heritage as humans, and we then have both the opportunity and responsibility to apply it well.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned responsibility, Sam, and I'd like to, if I could, just kind of take it in a whole other direction, because you talked about the reason for secrecy being for protection from persecution, but I kind of feel like there's another reason for secrecy, which is to protect us from the bad wizards. And there is another flip side or dark side to this whole, ritual magic thing, and that is the danger of open sourcing. And the reason for secrets sometimes can be literally to protect people from the lure of power and to give people responsibility that are interested in this material. And I think one of the reasons why there were secret societies was to develop discipline before engaging in some of these behaviors. And I know you said that we're far from the persecution of witches, but in fact, even this year, there's been murders due to people accusing people of witchcraft all over Africa, and there was even a huge ring in London that was related to an African child trade where they would, murder them and then ritually dismember them and use their body parts for witchcraft and ritual type of events. And so I wonder if you have any insight onto that, or if you personally have ever experienced some of that darker side of abuse of power that can happen within Golden Dawn or any of the different affiliations that you've been part of.
Well, that way of viewing the material to me is the same as suppressing knowledge of chemistry or electricity because it might be used in a harmful manner. It doesn't really actually help. The darkness behind which things hide create the illusion of evil magic users, but they are so rare, so few, and so rapidly self-destruct, there's almost no point in even considering them. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are these things that show up perhaps, not perhaps, but in Africa and so forth, most of which the person is not even a magic user, but they're simply being accused of that for all the same reasons that people got accused of being witches in Europe, most of which were simply abusive. If someone was
like the Thule Society and how that, some people think that led into Nazism and things like that, so it can kind of possibly reach larger proportions.
You can use technology of any kind, spiritual or material, to ill end, and there will always be people who do so. Right. And occasionally they'll be moderately successful, like the Nazis. Right. They were using it, and that triggered a similar counter-use in England in particular. We have records of this, to push them back. And look what happened. They lost. Hitler should have invaded England. He got confused. He didn't. He went and did the one thing he shouldn't do, invade Russia. They lost. There's a problem with using magic to evil end. It tends to destroy the user. So fairly rapidly, those who do it tend to get exposed and destroyed themselves. The people who use magic for good end tend to just produce good around them.
Well, it also seems like it's it's a reflection of a fundamental issue that we all face today in relationship to information. It's that it might be a good idea in some way that some things are difficult to find out about, but that we've sort of made a bid or a mass experiment in kind of information sharing with the idea that we still can evolve our cultural and moral and ethical frameworks to keep up with things. It's a race, but it does seem to be a more optimistic approach where there's a self-correcting aspect to information. There's a self-correcting aspect to this kind of ritual work where overall there's still a very positive direction out of it. But you must deal with this a fair amount, Sam, from people from a little bit outside of your framework, in the sense that one of the principal influences on the open source order is Thelema, is the sort of religious and mystical philosophy and approach founded by Aleister Crowley, who's of course for most people this caricature of this sort of excessive bad boy, and with some good reason biographically, but this is obviously, you are not coming from the oogly, spoogly, spooky space that some ceremonial magicians like to cultivate, at least with their demeanor. So I'm curious how, when you're when you're talking to people or when this comes up, about how you frame the way that Crowley is understood, how you approach the sort of inevitable questions like, God, he was such a jerk to women, he was such a bad guy in some ways, because that seems to be like, in some ways, he's almost an archetype for a lot of people of the way that the abuse of magic can create kind of power relations that are very unhealthy and end up even hurting the person. So I'm really curious about how you integrate Crowley's character and distinguish it from the value of the material that came through him.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. For me, Crowley is mostly irrelevant to Thelema. He wasn't a Thelemite. He clearly didn't understand it. He had some rather silly ideas that are rather Oldionic that don't really apply to Thelema. A lot of the stories that we have about Crowley, most of them aren't even true, and most of them are taken out of context. So, he's considered the bad boy of Western occultism, but, frankly, he's just not that important. This may be heretical to many Thelemites, but I'm sorry. If you read his material, only about 10% of it is original. Mostly all he's doing is compiling and beautifully arranging the material of the previous phase, which was highly encyclopedic. It had to be boiled down into something coherent, and he took a pretty good stab at that and integrated a bunch of Asian material, yoga, different kinds of meditation, and the like. But if we want to understand Thelema, the first thing you have to do is ignore Crowley. He didn't understand it. You got to pull him out of the way and let the texts talk for themselves. If we're going to take them seriously as delivered, then the only responsible way to deal with that material is to get the guy out of the way and let the text talk for itself. Well, and it produces a very different view.
Good. Well, can you open that up a little bit? Talk a little. People might hear the words Thelema and they might associate it with Crowley, but there's a whole mystical philosophy there. There's a whole set of texts that come through. Can you introduce that a little bit?
Okay. Well, first off, we have to say that it's not a philosophy. It isn't. What it is a set of spiritual writings that are poetry, that are not trying to explain rationally anything, that are instead evocative of a way of approaching the world. Every spiritual tradition has its own kind of vehicle, a fundamental focus that the practitioners hang on to and use that to advance themselves. For Christianity, this is belief. For Islam, it is submission. For the Taoist, it is the flow of the way. For the Buddhist, it is emptiness and compassion. These are the things that drive each of those different traditions. For Thelema, we focus on the will. And this is not, it is and it is not our personal will. That's the great paradox of Thelema, and it's a conundrum that is the process of working Thelema. It essentially posits that every individual is given by the whole system, which we might well call God, something to do, or at least a certain drive, a desire, a will, and that the individual's greatest satisfaction and greatest fulfillment and the greatest possibility for accomplishment is through figuring out what that is and going and doing it. And in that, we serve the world and each other the best. So the task is to continually ask, how is my will a manifestation of the divine will, and how do I refine that into pure will such that I am living out the divine will through my life?
And
I've always been kind of, confused, I guess I would say, when the idea of will, like love is the law, love under will. Again, how do you approach the conundrum? This whole question of personal will. I mean, I think it's a very big question too. I just want to frame it a little bit. It's not just about what this term means in this particular tradition, because you have this fundamental question of like who's willing? What is my personal will? Is my personal will an obstruction of this higher divine will, or is it actually the buddings of its true manifestation? When I make decisions in the world, I'd like to think that I'm actually deciding things, but oftentimes if I reflect on it later or even at the time, I see that there's sort of a jumble of different processes that come from culture and from my body and that are jostling about to try to create some decision space, and it becomes often very confusing about who's actually willing. So how does one work with will in an ordinary sense, in your daily sense, to refine it in light of this possibility of expressing a higher or divine will?
Well, that's where the technology all comes into play. We're given in our Thelemic scriptures this concept and this focus on will. However, Thelema is merely one branch of the greater art of theurgy, which goes back to about 200 A.D., and is the last great florescence of classical religious practice. This is a practice of purifying ourselves into a kind of clarity that permits the divine to shine through us, and our actions become enacted by and for the divine. So Thelema is just one approach to this, and the catharsis or purifications that we engage clarify and remove a lot of the detritus, the social conditioning and the like, but also personal trauma, suffering, distraction, passions and so forth that are unhelpful get cleared out of the way. We also then tonify ourselves so that we become stronger and better able to enact that will, and then go through a process of tuning ourselves to the cosmos. In that very process, through clarification and through this attunement, we then find ourselves being supported and guided by the world as a whole. And we find through our engagement with the world continual refocusing on what our purpose, our will, happens to be. And every individual gets, to a certain extent, a great deal different appreciation of that. So it has to be a very open kind of technology. But at the same time, the pattern and the result remains the same.
Well, Sam, I just couldn't agree with you more. I think a lot of people don't understand that. And for me, like when I would first start looking at basic occult books, like when they tell you about getting started, I mean, one of the first things you have to do, they suggest, you change your diet, you develop disciplines. They suggest starting martial arts. You implement a regimen of prayer or chants. It's all about kind of regime and discipline to focus your concentration and your will. And I really kind of came to understand the will through doing things like that. And Thich Nhat Hanh and some other Buddhist authors really helped me understand that. And that it's like even small things like not wanting to do the dishes, just making yourself do the dishes when you don't want to, that develops your will and strengthens it. And in turn then connects you to the greater source and to God just by doing these little things. And it really makes such a big difference. And I think people forget that aspect of occultism and magic, that it is about developing your ability to concentrate in these other little areas, and then that translates into a larger scale. And I was wondering if you could give an example of maybe a specific exercise that you did where you got to the discipline and the will and the concentration, and then you possibly felt that connection. Has that ever happened to you personally?
Sure. As the essence of what I do. However, the best way to approach it from this corner of the work is to understand that there are multiple kinds of discipline. For some people, it's about creating great regimentation, getting up, doing the same thing every day, and grinding their way through the work. Has its place. I've tried that. It doesn't actually work for me. Mm-hmm. I'm much more like the artist who gets up and looks at several canvases and says, I'll work on that one today. It's a looser style, but more suited to my kind of personality. I don't want to disparage one or the other. They each have their place. It's all about the engagement and the sticking to the work and looking for what needs to be transformed, what needs to be clarified, what needs to be purified, and just doing that. And for some people, that means getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and sitting and doing their meditations. For other people, it's about maintaining that kind of focus throughout the day and letting the actual day's work purify and clarify. Like, why am I having this emotional reaction to this person? Can I not get upset with them even though they're being abusive to me? Instead, can I find a way through this that works for us both? That's part of the challenge.
I'd love to have you expand a little bit on that. Even with a somewhat deeper understanding of what magic and theurgy is in terms of ritual, in terms of focusing and clarifying the mind, it still has this sort of sense of something one does, at a certain time in a special room in front of a special altar. I'm really curious, as someone who's worked with this stuff for so long, how does it manifest in your daily life? I mean, when you're going through and you're dealing with, whatever, the cops pull you over, you got to go in a meeting at work, or you're navigating through a mall, or how does some of the sensibility and the kinds of qualities of consciousness that are developed inside of magical practices really come to the fore in these ordinary situations for you?
Well, this is a place where listening to the Buddhists is really valuable. They have technology or analytical means whereby to judge whether or not a practice is helpful, and one of which is called view, meditation, and action. The view is the theory that you're operating by. In this case, perhaps we can say thelema is the theory that our own will is somehow integral with the will of the whole system, the divine. Meditation is where we engage in some kind of activity, a practice, in fact, usually in a very limited framework and time and place, whereby we cultivate that view into some deeper, immediate awareness. So it's no longer a concept, but now a felt experience. So perhaps performing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram 3 times a day for 30 days. That's a classic thing that we have people do. What this does is it calms and clears and focuses the mind and the entire energy system and the body of the person doing the practice. Then we go out into life. And so first is view, our theory, meditation is our practice, and then action is taking this out into the world. When a person has been doing these kinds of activities, what happens is their mind becomes calm, their passions, their energies become more still and stable, and one's less thrown off by the challenges of life. That doesn't mean that the challenges aren't there. In fact, a good practitioner will go out into the very places that challenge them the most and see whether or not they're doing any better. So, dealing with a difficult colleague, dealing with nasty traffic or something like that, do I get upset? Can I deal with this colleague in a useful manner? And then I go back, I look at my theory. Do I still understand my theory? Then I go back to my practice, and I continue my meditations, refining myself, and then I go back out into the world. Because unless we're out where the rubber's meeting the road, we have no idea whether or not we're doing any good to ourselves.
I have another question for you about the nature of the gods, because it seems to me that one of the things I find very interesting about contemporary magic and paganism is that there's a way to approach even really far out experiences as far as most people are concerned, the invocation of a god form, the sense that one is either becoming this god or is having a direct encounter with them. But people can understand and account for those in different ways, some of which are actually not very supernatural or not very belief-driven. And I think that, again, oftentimes from the outside, it looks like when people are getting into these things, they're just getting into ever more arcane and sort of even silly sort of belief systems. And yet there seems to be a way of approaching this fundamental mystery of the nature of the gods, the nature of this sense of these kinds of spirits, these kinds of archetypes, that doesn't really emphasize belief and yet still kind of allows them their own sort of autonomy or their own sort of experience. I'm curious how you would account for that, like what is the nature of the gods?
Well, first, the other word that you kept throwing out in there is belief. Sorry to say this, Eric, but belief to me is the enemy. It's the thing that we need to get out of our religious space, our spiritual space. It is the biggest impediment to spiritual experience I know of. Christianity, and Christianity alone, is the only religion on the planet that actually gives a damn about belief. Yes, people have beliefs, which is really just their theory about what they're doing, but belief is central to Christianity. Believe on Christ and you too will be saved. I have no use for this kind of stuff. I don't need the saving, and believing is just an impediment. I don't care. I don't want to believe, and wherever I find it within my mind, I either can eliminate it or I have to kind of sequester it so it doesn't do any more damage than it's already doing. But at a certain level, you find yourself saying, I think that's true, but I don't know if it's true. That's a belief. Dealing with the gods, like Iamblichus says in the beginning of De Mysteries, believing in the gods is irrelevant and is going down the wrong path. If you believe in the gods, it's not helpful. You must learn to see the gods in all things, and that's actually not very hard because they are the fundamental structures of what is. And while at a certain level there is culturally conditioned and historically deep relationships with specific manifestations of those divine principles, fundamentally they lie utterly beyond anything even vaguely like human. So when we're talking Eros or Aphrodite, we experience that every day in gravity and magnetism and interpersonal love. That is her.
Yeah.
So there's no belief involved.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I've just always felt that belief stops you from experiencing, and I've always thought that the Catholic Church specifically would encourage people to believe, although Christianity in general, to believe so that they thought they couldn't have that experience. And that's what kind of stopped mysticism and shamanism, because it literally removes you from the gods. So it is extremely damaging.
Yes, but that's the function of Christianity, is to focus everything under one particular God, who then claims to be the creator and the source of all being and all that kind of stuff. It's understandable if you're an imperialist.
I love your last example when you're talking about Aphrodite or Eros, where it's sort of easy to imagine that one way that would manifest in our lives is in interpersonal relations and the experience of love and the experience of desire. But you went farther than that, or you went in a different direction than that, and you also talked about it in terms of magnetism, in terms of gravity. How do you feel like that the pagan or and magical frame allow the ability to integrate scientific facts, things we really know about how the world we live in actually works, into this larger framework without creating the kinds of conflicts that we see all over the place in terms of the science-religion debate and all that? I don't want to get into that, but there's something clearly open-ended about the way that you approach these things that allows for the integration of scientific understandings of things.
Well, the only reason for the debate is because there is a belief and creedal-based religion as dominant in our society. Most other places, it's not really a meaningful debate. You see, originally you have just magic, and then magic breaks down into religion and science. Science and religion are both just subsets of the techne of living in the world, of understanding the spiritual and material dimensions of the world. So the split is literally the result of a historical choice during the founding of the Royal Society of England. Charles II, who was petitioned by the Oxford group to create this, who incidentally were a bunch of alchemists and astrologers and all those kinds of things, wanting to study nature for the common good, very much like the Rosicrucian paradigm. But Charles II was put back on the throne of England right after the Puritan Revolution that was a very bloody, brutal religious war. And so he didn't want the discussion of the religious implications of science to even be there, so otherwise it was going to cause trouble. He had already put down one religious war. So that split separated these two halves of what really should be a single whole, which some of us refer to as magic.
Right. It also seems like there's something fundamentally open and evolving about your approach. And that's, I think, also a difference with a lot of the ways people think about traditions, is like traditions are kind of done. Whereas this open approach, whether it's open to new scientific facts, new cosmological understandings, or also just open to the constant influx of new information about new religious systems. So there's a kind of DIY quality to this pagan magical path you're talking about that allows a lot of room for a constant re-engagement with things as they arise. Where does that sense of evolution, how do you understand that? I think this is actually going to be one of our last questions, and I wanted to throw in before you answer that, actually, that I am talking to Sam Webster, and you can find out more about the Open Source Order of the Golden Dawn by going to www.osogd.org. And there's also some writings from Sam on www.hermetic.com/Webster. So, Sam, could you just talk a little bit about DIY religion?
Well, this is part of the fundamental feeling and framework of the open source. When this started happening in the realm of computer code, the source being exposed, people could take a look at a piece of it, attempt to fix it or improve upon it, and then put it back into the code stream and see if it runs. It takes a fundamental attitude that we must be responsible for the platform on which we're standing, and if that happens to be the religious corner of the platform, well, that's just the same. We need to be responsible about this, and that includes taking a look at it and changing the pieces we don't like. It's not entirely the supermarket approach that one of the popes complained about. No, this is actually going into the machinery underneath the presentation and changing things as needed, because this is what it is to be an adult. Our species hovers on the edge of the end of our adolescence, about to step into our adulthood. We may or may not actually make the jump. That's what the big crisis is that we're in the midst of now. But one of the fundamental things about being an adult is taking responsibility for what it is that you do and how it is that you live. And therefore, we have a responsibility to get under the covers and understand what it is that we have inherited, and therefore have the capacity to change it. And if it doesn't do what we need it to do, we have to change it. And if we don't change our religions and our frameworks, our beliefs, our attitudes, our ways of going through the world, well, this culture is headed towards its destruction. I have hope and faith that humans will manage to pull this off. Part of what I'm trying to do here is show that we can do this in the space of our spirituality and come together to form groups of people who can work to shift the world into the right attitude that will survive. Technologically, I don't think we have even the slightest problem in fixing any of the challenges that face before us. But we don't have the will, we don't have the desire at the fundamental level to make changes in order to make our human world survive. The planet's going to go on. I'm not so sure about the humans. That's where we have to step up.
And how do you see the particular tools and techniques and inspirations of the magical Hermetic tradition helping in that? Does it have to do with with changing our relationship with the earth? Does it have to do with actually encouraging a kind of internal a grasp of responsibility and of a certain kind of manifest will? Because I can hear a lot of things you're saying, and I can imagine like a more secular person going, yeah, but we know what we need to do. It's all a technological problem. It's all just about, we don't need this sort of the sort of tendrils of superstition or these old practices that are kind of weird, like proto-folk psychology. Now we know what we need to do. We can just look forward. And you're saying that there's still a lot to be gained from engaging with these currents and transforming them to our current state. What is it that they have that is difficult to get otherwise?
Well, the piece that appeals to me the most about the Western theurgic tradition, which is really what we're talking about here, is twofold. One, it brings us deeper into harmony with the world, literally. Not as a theory, not as an idea, I'm connected to everything, but as a lived experience where you find yourself plugged into the cosmos as a whole. This is not an idea. This is not a dream, but it's a lived experience of how everything that is you and in you is echoed and reflected through the world around you and feeding back. Then, once that's been established, what arises out of that is a recognition of what your own place is in the whole of things and the necessity for doing that which is your role. If each of us are playing our own melody, the symphony that can arise is fabulous, and we are so far from there yet. We're not even tuning our instruments for the most of us.
Well, it's interesting, and I love that you study so many different disciplines, because literally that is what you're talking about is the heart of the mystical experience, and it exists in every religion and literally every culture, and goes back really into our prehistory, into shamanism.
Sure does.
And, you say that we're far away from that, but really humans have been doing that from prehistory in the shamanic tradition and being able to achieve that state. And it is something that is an underlying current. So even though I would definitely agree with you that people tend to not focus so much on that and think about that they can live that experience of connectedness, because we can find so many things to distract ourselves with. Wouldn't you agree that it's something that is inherent in our nature and in our capacity and potentiality, and that people could just kind of like maybe turn a switch and turn their cheek and kind of head that way?
I think it's the birthright of every sentient being to experience themselves as a manifestation of the whole of being and to become aware of their place in the whole and the necessity for doing their part in it. That, I believe, is for everyone. Unfortunately, down the centuries, down the millennia, down the tens of thousands of years that humans have existed, 100,000 that we can be really clear about, of our kind of humanity, it's only been practiced by an elite. But that's the point, that's why we have to take it out of the secrecy. We have to take it out of being a practice for the elite. Mind you, while I don't think Crowley is a great example for Thelema, I still think the man was brilliant. And if we look at the opening to Magic in Theory and Practice, he has this long list of who is this for. And it's the Navy and the shop girl and the executive and the typesetter, and it is for everyone.
Yeah.
When we understand that we're part of the world, and that we are to articulate our part of that whole of the world, then we're at our best. We're at our most satisfied. We're at our strongest, and we're doing the piece that we need to be doing. And if each and every individual is doing their piece, the whole works. Frankly, I think it's rather robust, so it's not too dangerous for, some people to be off. But for the species to survive, we need a lot more of us doing it.
And is that a way of explaining what is, to my mind, one of the most evocative pieces of poetry from the Thelemic tradition, which is this idea that every man and woman is a star?
Indeed. And this is an ancient idea. The starry nature of people go back to prehistory, we've been able to determine. And so this concept has been growing and being nurtured down the eons, and now it's the critical time at adulthood level where we need to step up and actually become those stars.
And because one of the things that's really struck me about that and why it stays with me is that on one level, it's a very attractive image because it's the sense of blazing, of being your own light, of uncovering that primal source within one so that one blazes. But there's also a sense that as we look at the night sky and there's billions and billions of stars that are, each in their own space, in their own location, that there is also a kind of embrace of a kind of aloneness or a kind of solitude that gets to that place so that stars can communicate to each other. They can shine to each other. They can form constellations. But part of that responsibility to me also seems to be not expecting that there is going to be some big daddy that you can fall into an ultimate embrace of union with, that there's something particular about your role, your will, your place in the universe, and that part of being able to manifest that is actually embracing the singularity of it, not just the way that it's resembling everything else.
Indeed. I don't think there's a whole lot of value in becoming like everything else, since one was created. One was clearly created as an individual. And so to not be that individual is to withhold from the great system of the world the possibility of your own real contribution. The metaphor that works beautifully for this in my mind is the nature of an alloy, and bronze being the most marvelous example. Bronze is strange material. Copper, lead, and tin, all of which are very soft, are blended together, producing an extremely hard, extremely durable material. If any one of those parts is missing, or if they're not as pure as they need to be for creating an alloy, the whole of the new product is degraded. So each of us, by this metaphor, have the responsibility to refine the ore of our being into becoming that pure metal, and then blending ourselves with everything else around us to produce the alloy at the level of strength and durability that is required by the real world.
That sounds like real alchemy.
Yeah, it is, in fact.
Maja, any last questions? Comments?
I'm just really excited, Sam, that you're doing this kind of work and letting people know these things. And
Thank you.
Because sometimes people just need to know that they have a star inside to let it shine. Sometimes just telling them that is, enough to help.
That's where we start. We start by telling them, and then we show them how to get there.
Great. Well, I just wanted once again to thank Sam Webster for speaking with us here on Expanding Mind. Again, the website is www.osogd.org, and you can also do a web search on his name, Sam Webster, and find some of his articulate articles. We are going to get a book out of him one of these days, so keep tuned for that. Again, this is Expanding Mind, and next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Pacific Eastern Standard Time, we'll be talking to Mitch Horowitz, who's the author of a fascinating new book called Occult America, which really is the first book I know to really treat in a rich survey form the variety of occult traditions that have helped make America what it is. So once again, for us at Expanding Mind, keep it open.